My girlfriend mocked me in Spanish all through dinner with her parents, said I was too dumb to understand. She laughed. Until I replied in fluent Spanish and revealed every lie she'd hidden from them. My girlfriend insisted I meet her parents over dinner. She trashed me in Spanish to them all night, thinking I wouldn't understand. She laughed. He's too stupid to even know. At the end of the dinner, I thanked her parents for their hospitality in perfect fluent Spanish and then exposed every lie she'd ever told me. My girlfriend of 2 years, Isabella, had been on a mission for the last 6 months. The mission was simple: get me to meet her parents. I was hesitant, not because I was afraid of commitment but because of how she described them. They sounded intense, traditional, and deeply intertwined in her life. Isabella, however, was relentless. She insisted it was the most important next step in our relationship. Finally, I agreed. The big dinner was scheduled for last night at their home in Coral Gables, Florida. I had no idea I wasn't walking into a dinner. I was walking into an ambush. Before I continue, I need to explain something about myself that is crucial to this story. My last name is Thompson. I look, for all intents and purposes, like a typical American guy from the Midwest. But my mother, who passed away from breast cancer when I was 17, was from Barcelona, Spain. She moved to the United States in her 20s to pursue her dreams as a nurse. For my entire childhood, Spanish was the language of our home in Columbus, Ohio. It was the language she used to sing me lullabies, to tell me bedtime stories, to whisper "te amo" when she tucked me in. After she died, speaking Spanish became painful. It was a private language filled with memories of her warm smile and gentle hands. I packed it away in a quiet corner of my heart and rarely used it. Isabella knew my mother had passed away, but she never dug any deeper. She's not one for details unless they directly concern her. She just knew my dad was American, a mechanic who owned his own shop, and assumed my mom was too. In 2 years together, she never once asked about my mother's heritage or background. The fact that I was fluent in perfect Castilian Spanish was a secret I never intentionally kept, but one she was never curious enough to discover. We had been living together in my downtown Miami apartment for 8 months. Isabella worked as a marketing coordinator for a luxury hotel chain, while I was a structural engineer at Henderson & Associates, one of the city's most respected firms. Our relationship seemed solid on the surface, but looking back now, I realized there were warning signs I chose to ignore. She had a tendency to embellish stories to make herself look better. Small things at first, claiming she had run a half marathon when she'd actually walked most of it, or saying she spoke conversational French when she barely knew basic phrases. I chalked it up to harmless exaggeration, the kind everyone does to impress people. But as we drove through the palm-lined streets toward her family's Spanish colonial home that evening, I felt an unusual knot in my stomach. Something about Isabella's nervous energy, the way she kept checking her reflection in the visor mirror, made me wonder what exactly I was walking into. We arrived at the Valdez family home just as the sun was setting over Biscayne Bay. The house was exactly as Isabella had described, warm and inviting on the surface, but with an undercurrent of formality that made me straighten my tie. Her father, Mr. Valdez, gave me a firm handshake with calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work and construction. Her mother, Mrs. Valdez, offered a polite but cool smile, her dark eyes appraising me like I was a piece of furniture she wasn't sure would fit in the room. We sat down in their formal dining room, complete with a mahogany table that could seat 12 and a crystal chandelier that caught the last rays of daylight. The smell of arroz con pollo and fresh bread filled the air. Mrs. Valdez had clearly spent hours preparing this meal, and I made sure to compliment everything genuinely. "This is incredible, Mrs. Valdez," I said, gesturing to the beautifully set table. "Thank you so much for having me." She smiled warmly at that, and I thought maybe the ice was beginning to thaw. That's when the performance began. Isabella immediately started speaking rapid-fire Spanish with her parents. She turned to me with a brilliant smile that I now recognize as completely fake. "We're just so excited to see each other," she said in English. "We'll switch to English in a minute, I promise." The switch never came. For the next 2 hours, I sat at that dinner table and listened to the woman I loved systematically destroy my character in a language she thought was a secret code. I smiled politely. I nodded when they looked at me. I passed the plantains and the black beans. I complimented the flan. And I understood every single poisonous word. It started with my career. Isabella told them in Spanish that I was fine as an engineer, but not very ambitious. "He's happy in his little cubicle," she said with a dismissive wave. "I'm the one with the real drive. I have to pay for most of our nice dinners and weekend trips to Key West." This was a staggering lie. I made nearly 3 times her salary and had paid for every vacation we'd ever taken, including the recent weekend at the Ritz-Carlton in South Beach that she'd been bragging about on Instagram for weeks. Then she moved on to my personality and interests. "He's a nice guy, I suppose," she said with a theatrical sigh. "But he has no interest in our culture. He won't even try to learn a few words of Spanish. He's just a typical boring gringo who only cares about football and burgers. It's exhausting sometimes." I had literally just finished reading Cien Años de Soledad by Gabriel Garcia Marquez in its original Spanish text the week before. A book that had moved me to tears because it reminded me of the magical stories my mother used to tell. As I sat there, maintaining my polite smile while my character was being assassinated, I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. This wasn't just casual exaggeration anymore. This was deliberate, calculated deception. And the worst part? She kept looking at me with those loving, fake smiles while doing it. The final dagger came when the conversation turned to our future. Mrs. Valdez, her voice warm with maternal concern, asked if we were serious about each other, if marriage was on the table. Isabella laughed, a light, tinkling sound that now sounded like breaking glass to my ears. "Oh, I definitely want to get married," she said in Spanish, reaching across to pat my hand affectionately. "But he's the one dragging his feet. I think he's terrified of commitment. I have to practically beg him to even talk about the future. Sometimes I wonder if he'll ever grow up and take our relationship seriously." In my jacket pocket, carefully wrapped in velvet, was the custom engagement ring I'd been designing with a jeweler in Aventura for the past 2 months. It featured a stunning emerald-cut diamond surrounded by smaller stones arranged in a pattern inspired by the Moorish tiles my mother had always loved. I was planning to propose during a surprise trip to Barcelona, her city, that I had booked for Isabella's birthday next month. The conversation continued in this vein all evening. They dissected my character, my finances, my family, and my future, all while I sat there like a smiling guest at my own public execution. The worst part wasn't just the lies, it was her casual cruelty. The way she would look at me with soft, loving expressions while simultaneously telling her parents that I was a simple-minded financial burden who couldn't even be bothered to learn basic Spanish phrases. Mrs. Valdez served homemade tres leches cake for dessert, and I complimented it genuinely, trying to maintain some dignity in this surreal situation. That's when Isabella delivered what she clearly thought would be her final, fatal blow. Her father, Carlos, looked at me thoughtfully and asked his daughter in Spanish, "Are you sure about him, Mija? He seems simple." Isabella laughed and reached across the table to pat my hand again, her touch now feeling like ice against my skin. She looked me right in the eye, her expression full of fake affection, and said to her parents in rapid Spanish, "It's fine, Poppy. He's too stupid to even know we're talking about him. Look at him just smiling like an idiot. Americans are so clueless about everything outside their little bubble. He probably thinks we're discussing the weather." That was it. The grief for my mother, the rage at being betrayed, the humiliation of being mocked, it all crystallized into a single point of cold, hard resolve. I was not going to cause a scene. I was not going to raise my voice. I was not going to give Isabella the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. Instead, I was going to wait for the perfect moment, and I was going to burn down her entire world of lies with nothing but the truth. The moment came as we were getting ready to leave. Mr. Valdez, clearly feeling a bit guilty about how little English had been spoken, turned to me with an apologetic smile. He spoke in slow, careful English as if addressing a child. "It was very nice to meet you, Eric," he said, patting my shoulder. "You are welcome in our home anytime." I smiled warmly back at him. It was time. I looked Mr. Valdez directly in the eyes, and the language of my mother, the language Isabella had weaponized against me, came pouring out as natural as breathing. "El placer fue completamente mío, Señor Valdez," I said in perfect, unaccented Castilian Spanish. "The pleasure was entirely mine, Mr. Valdez." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Mrs. Valdez's fork clattered onto her dessert plate, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent dining room. Mr. Valdez's jaw went slack, his weathered face registering shock and confusion. And Isabella? Isabella turned a color I had never seen a human being turn before. A pale, ghostly white that made her look like she might faint right there in her mother's dining room. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. I kept my warm, polite smile fixed on my face and turned to Mrs. Valdez. "Why usted, Señora Valdez, es una cocinera increíble. La cena estuvo deliciosa. Muchas gracias por su maravillosa hospitalidad." Mrs. Valdez just stared at me, her hand moving unconsciously to her chest as if to steady her racing heart. I turned back to the family as a whole, still speaking in the clear, formal Spanish my mother had taught me at our kitchen table in Ohio. Why Isabella también quiero agradecer. Esta noche ha sido increíblemente esclarecedora. Isabella looked like a chess player who had just realized her opponent wasn't an amateur, but a grandmaster who had been letting her think she was winning for sport. The silence in the Valdez dining room was absolute, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the sound of Mrs. Valdez's unsteady breathing. I maintained my calm, pleasant demeanor as if I were simply making polite end-of-evening conversation. There are just a few small things I'd like to clarify while we're all here together, I continued in Spanish, my voice carrying the same warm tone I'd used all evening. First, I began, addressing her parents directly. Isabella expressed some concern about my career and financial situation. I want to put your minds at ease, she must have been confused. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, bringing up the email confirmation from my firm. I was actually promoted to senior project manager last month, with a significant salary increase. I'm doing quite well, thank you. I then showed them the flight confirmation for the Barcelona trip I'd planned. As for her claim about paying for our vacations, this is the surprise trip I was taking her on next month. First-class tickets to Barcelona, a suite at the Hotel Casa Fuster. I believe there was some confusion about who pays for our travels. Isabella's perfectly applied makeup was starting to run as a single tear traced down her cheek. She didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there as her world crumbled around her. Second, I continued, my voice taking on a more serious tone, she mentioned my supposed lack of interest in Spanish culture. This wounded me deeply. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. My mother, Elena, was from Barcelona. She raised me speaking her beautiful language. After she passed away from cancer, it became too painful to share with others. It was sacred to me. Mrs. Valdez gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth. The look of shock on her face was being rapidly replaced by something else. Sympathy, and a growing understanding of just how deeply her daughter had betrayed me. Mr. Valdez leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting from confusion to what looked like dawning disappointment as he stared at Isabella. I didn't share this part of myself with Isabella because it was the most precious thing I had left of my mother, I continued, my voice steady but carrying an edge of pain. Her assumption that my silence was due to ignorance and disrespect is unfortunate. Isabella finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Eric, I can explain? I held up a gentle hand, cutting her off. Please let me finish. I turned back to her parents, switching back to Spanish. And finally, the matter of commitment. This was the killing blow, and I delivered it with surgical precision. You told your parents that I was afraid of marriage, that I was the one putting off our future together. You said this knowing that I have spent the last 2 months working with Goldstein Jewelers in Aventura to design a custom engagement ring. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the small velvet box, placing it on the mahogany table where everyone could see it. You said this knowing that I was planning to propose to you under the stars in Barcelona, in the city where my mother was born, where she learned to dream of America. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Isabella's tears were flowing freely now, cutting tracks through her foundation. Mr. and Mrs. Valdez just stared at the ring box, then at their daughter, then back at me. But I see now, I continued, my voice losing its pleasant tone and taking on a cold, final edge, that a man cannot and should not propose to a woman who believes he is stupid and clueless. A man cannot build a future with someone who uses the sacred language of his late mother as a weapon to mock him, to diminish him in front of her family. I stood up from the table, the chair scraping against the tile floor. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. I want to thank you both again, I said to her parents, switching back to English so there could be no misunderstanding. You have a beautiful home and dinner was wonderful. I'm sorry this evening had to end this way. Mr. Valdez stood as well, his face grave. Eric, we had no idea? I know you didn't, sir. This isn't your fault. I looked at Isabella one last time. She was still sitting frozen in her chair, mascara streaking down her cheeks, looking like someone who had just watched their entire world collapse in real time. Isabella, I'll be waiting in the car, I said quietly. Take as long as you need to say goodbye. Then I walked out of that dining room, through their beautifully decorated living room, and out into the warm Miami night, leaving Isabella to sit in the ruins of the world she had created with her own lies. The drive back to our downtown Miami apartment was the longest 30 minutes of my life. Isabella eventually emerged from the house and got into my Honda Accord, but we didn't speak. The silence was deafening, louder than any argument we'd ever had. I could hear her sniffling in the passenger seat, but I kept my eyes on the road, watching the city lights blur past us. When we finally got inside our apartment, the lease was in my name, something that would become very important very soon. The dam finally broke. Isabella exploded. "You deceived me," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You tricked me. You set me up. You knew the whole time and you just sat there and let me talk. You did this to humiliate me in front of my parents." I set my keys down on the kitchen counter and looked at her calmly. "No, Isabella. I didn't do anything. I just sat at a table and existed. You did the rest. You humiliated yourself with your own words, with your own lies. The only thing I did was understand them." She started crying then, real, ugly crying, not the delicate tears from dinner. She begged me to forgive her, saying she didn't mean any of it, that she was just trying to make her parents like me by making herself look better in comparison. "It's what families do," she sobbed. "We complain about our partners to each other. It doesn't mean anything. It's just venting." The excuses were as pathetic as they were transparent. "Isabella," I said, my voice weary but firm, "you didn't just vent. You systematically lied about every aspect of our life together. You told them I was financially irresponsible when I pay for everything. You told them I was culturally ignorant when I've been reading Spanish literature since I was 12. You told them I was afraid of commitment when I was planning to propose next month." I paused, letting that sink in. "And worst of all, you used my mother's memory as the backdrop for your little performance. You turned the language she taught me, the language she loved me in, into a weapon to hurt me. That is unforgivable." I walked into our bedroom and started pulling my suitcase out of the closet. Isabella followed me, her sobs becoming more desperate. "What are you doing? Eric, please, we can work through this. I'll go to therapy. I'll do whatever you want. Please don't throw away 2 years because of one mistake." I turned to face her, and for the first time that night, I let her see the full extent of my anger and disappointment. "This apartment is in my name, Isabella. The lease, the utilities, everything. I want you to pack your things. I want you out by the end of the week." She stared at me, her face crumbling as the finality of my words sank in. She hadn't just lost an argument or even a relationship. She had lost her home, her future, and her dignity all in one devastating evening. "You can stay at your parents' house while you figure out what comes next," I added. "I'm sure they'll have plenty to discuss with you." 6 months have passed since that disastrous dinner in Coral Gables, and the fallout from Isabella's web of lies continues to ripple through both our lives, though in very different ways. The week after the dinner was a grim affair. Isabella moved through our apartment like a ghost, packing her life into cardboard boxes from U-Haul. The atmosphere was thick with her resentful sorrow and my own cold resolve. There were a few more pathetic attempts at tearful apologies, but they were half-hearted. She knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return. She wasn't sorry for what she did, she was sorry she got caught. True to my word, she was gone by Friday. I helped her load the last box into her silver Nissan Altima, and we didn't say goodbye. I just closed the door, went back inside my apartment, and felt the profound peace that comes with removing a toxic presence from your life. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days after Isabella left, my phone rang. Unknown number. It was Mr. Valdez, Carlos, and his voice was heavy with shame. "Eric," he said. "This is Carlos Valdez. I'm calling to apologize." I was genuinely surprised. "You have nothing to apologize for, sir." "No, I do," he insisted. "I apologize for my daughter's behavior in my home. I apologize for the things she said and for the fact that we just sat there and allowed it to happen. What she did to you and to the memory of your mother was shameful. We raised her to be better than that, and clearly we failed somewhere." He told me they'd had a long, difficult conversation with Isabella after I left. When confronted with the truth, she had completely broken down and admitted to everything. He said they were deeply disappointed and ashamed. "You are a good man, Eric," he concluded. "A man of character. I'm sorry my family caused you such pain." That phone call was the first sign that Isabella's support system wasn't as solid as she'd believed. Her parents, who had always been in her corner no matter what, were so disgusted by her deception that she'd managed to alienate her biggest allies. Meanwhile, Isabella tried spinning the narrative with our mutual friends, telling them I had a secret life, and was manipulative and deceptive. It didn't work. The story of the dinner was too specific, too dramatic, and too damning. I only had to tell the true version to 1 or 2 close friends, and from there it spread like wildfire through our social circle. The image of me sitting silently while my girlfriend unknowingly insulted me in a language I secretly understood was far more compelling than her vague accusations of deception. As for me, I sold the engagement ring and used the money for a different kind of trip. Not to Barcelona as originally planned, but to Barcelona anyway, alone this time. I spent 2 weeks walking the streets my mother had walked, eating the food she'd loved, speaking her language not as a secret, but as a celebration. I came back feeling whole, centered, and free. Isabella tried to define me as stupid and clueless. Instead, she revealed herself as someone who couldn't see the value of what was right in front of her. And that's a loss far greater than any I could have ever inflicted.